Okay, get ready for one of the most unbelievable, stranger-than-fiction stories in the entire history of science. We're going to talk about the incredible, decades-long journey of Albert Einstein's brain after he died.
I mean, really, think about that for a second. What if you had the physical key to understanding one of the greatest minds that ever lived? What would you do? And maybe more importantly, what would possessing something like that do to you? Well, believe it or not, that is not a hypothetical question. Because back in 1955, a pathologist named Thomas Harvey found himself in that exact position. And he made a choice that would not only derail his entire life, but create a scientific legend. He stole the brain. And that, right there, is where this whole crazy story kicks off.
So you're probably wondering, how on earth did this even happen? Let's rewind the clock to the day the world lost its most famous scientist.
So it's April 18th, 1955. Albert Einstein passes away at Princeton Hospital. The pathologist on call that day is Dr. Thomas Harvey. He performs the autopsy, does his job, and then he does something else. He removes the brain, weighs it. It's 1,230 grams, by the way, and instead of putting it back where it belongs, he takes it home with him.
Now, this wasn't just a minor oversight. This act went completely against Einstein's own explicit wishes. He had been crystal clear. He wanted his body cremated, specifically to prevent this exact kind of thing, to avoid his remains becoming some kind of relic, and starting the very circus that was about to begin.
Harvey eventually got in touch with Einstein's son, Hans Albert, who was, as you can imagine, not happy about this at all. But Harvey was, I guess, persuasive. He managed to convince him to grant permission after the fact, but there were two huge conditions. Any research had to be for serious science, and there was to be zero sensationalism. That was a promise that would prove pretty much impossible to keep.
So to get the brain ready for what he hoped would be groundbreaking study, Harvey had it photographed from every angle, and then he sectioned it into 240 distinct blocks, preserving them in a rubbery substance. This single act of cutting the brain into pieces would literally define its bizarre journey for the next 50 years. So for the next 4 decades, Einstein's brain wasn't in some high-tech lab. Nope. It was on this strange, wandering road trip, and its keeper, Thomas Harvey, was on a journey of his own, and it was pretty much straight downhill. You see, instead of bringing him fame and fortune, the brain became this cursed object. Harvey almost immediately lost his job at Princeton. His obsession with the brain led to failed marriages, a collapsing personal life. By 1988, he'd actually lost his medical license and ended up working on an assembly line in a plastics factory in Kansas. His grand scientific dream had led him to absolute ruin.
And the way he stored this priceless scientific artifact? It's just absurd. For years, the brain of one of humanity's greatest geniuses was kept in the weirdest places. The most famous one? The brain blocks floating in mason jars were kept in a cardboard cider box tucked right underneath a beer cooler. You just can't make this stuff up.
The story just gets weirder, hitting peak folklore in 1997. A journalist convinced the now elderly Harvey to go on a road trip. The plan? Drive all the way across the country to meet Einstein's granddaughter, Evelyn. And what were they hauling in the trunk of their Buick? You guessed it, chunks of Einstein's brain, just sloshing around in a Tupperware bowl.
Okay, so after decades of being hidden away in a Tupperware bowl, the first real attempts at some kind of scientific analysis finally started in the 1980s. So what did they find?
Well, the first big study looked at something called glial cells. The easiest way to think of these is like the support groove for your brain. The neurons are the stars doing all the thinking, and the glial cells are the ones that feed them, clean up after them, and protect them. The idea was simple. Maybe a genius brain just needs a bigger support crew. So 2 big claims came out of this early research. First, that Einstein had way more glial cells in a part of his brain responsible for conceptual thought. This suggested his brain cells were working overtime and needed extra support. The second claim was even wilder, that a whole fold in his brain was just missing, which might have allowed his math and spatial reasoning areas to get bigger. But both of these theories kind of fell apart. The glial cell study was criticized for having a tiny sample size, and that whole missing fold idea, it turned out to be completely wrong once scientists got a better look. So for years, the science was on pretty shaky ground. But then came a plot twist that you'd expect to find in a detective novel, and it blew the whole case wide open. Thomas Harvey died in 2007, and in 2010, his family did something amazing. They donated his entire secret archive, and inside it was the Holy Grail, 14 pristine, high-resolution photographs of the entire brain taken from multiple angles before Harvey ever took a knife to it. This was a total game-changer.
This discovery completely changed everything. Scientists were no longer stuck studying these tiny, poorly preserved fragments. For the first time, they could analyze high-res photos of the whole, intact brain. They could stop just counting cells in one little spot and start looking at the big picture, the brain's overall structure and how all the different parts were connected.
So what did this new research find? Some really remarkable stuff. They saw an unusually complex prefrontal cortex. That's the part you use for abstract thought, perfect for his famous thought experiments. They also found an expanded motor cortex in the region that controls the left hand, which is almost certainly a nod to his lifelong passion for playing the violin. But the biggest finding of all was about how the two halves of his brain talk to each other.
So there's this bundle of nerve fibers, kind of like an information superhighway that connects the left and right hemispheres of your brain. It's called the corpus callosum, and when researchers looked at it in those old photos, they found that Einstein's was significantly thicker and better connected than in control groups of both younger and older people. This suggests his two brain hemispheres could communicate much more efficiently, a huge advantage when you're trying to combine logic with visual imagination, which is exactly what you need to do to, say, imagine riding on a beam of light.
So after its bizarre, decades-long journey, where did this famous brain finally end up, and what's its ultimate legacy? Well, the scattered pieces of this incredible puzzle are now in safe hands. Most of the original blocks finally made their way back to Princeton. Harvey's full archive, with those incredibly important photographs, is secure at a national museum. And if you ever want to see a piece of this history for yourself, you actually can. The Mütter Museum in Philadelphia has 46 of the slides on permanent public display.
And that brings us back to Thomas Harvey and his really complicated legacy. Ethically, what he did was a disaster. Professionally, his life became a total cautionary tale. But that one decision he made back in 1955 to meticulously photograph the whole brain before he sliced it up was an accidental act of scientific genius. Without those photos, none of the credible modern research we have today would even be possible. Which leaves us with the ultimate chicken and egg question. We know now that Einstein's brain was physically different, but were those differences the cause of his genius, or were they the result of a lifetime spent thinking in ways no one had ever thought before? It seems the secret to genius might not be just in the organ itself, but in the incredible mystery of how a person chooses to use it.